Robinson, United States Air Force, 1961 to 1984, POW from 1965 to 1973. Well, in 1961, the rules of the road were that, you had a military obligation. And when you applied for employment, the first question they would ask you, and you got your military obligation over with, and you say no, and they said, well, come back and talk to us when you get that taken care of. They didn't care whether you were 4F or what. They just didn't want it to interfere with their interest as far as getting, future employees. And so basically all of us at that age, if we weren't going off to college, then we would go get a military obligation over with. And we had different choices. We could volunteer for the draft, which was a 2-year, or you could join the Army, which is 3, or join the Navy, which is 3, and Marine Corps was 4, and the Air Force was 4. And I looked at the different branches of service, and I just happened to have friends that were relatives, you might say, that had been in all different branches, and I just liked the conversation that I had with the airmen versus the sailors, or like I said, and so I decided to go in the Air Force. And of course, I had to wait till I was 18 because I graduated at 17, and the only way I could go in prior to 18 was to get my father or stepmother to sign for me, and I didn't want anybody to be responsible for something I chose to do, so I had to wait till I was 18. And I'd also applied for the Newport News Shipyard and Dry Dock, which was a deferment, but unfortunately my request for an application couldn't be filed until I was 18, and I was just tired of waiting, and so I went and talked to the recruiter, and the recruiter said, well, we'd love to have you, and I said, well, I'm ready to go. When can I leave? He said, let's think about November. I said, well, what's happened to September and October? He said, well, that's not a good month to go into, So I said, well, if I'm going to have to wait till November, I might as well wait till after the first of the year and go after Christmas. He said, no, you don't want to do that. I said, November and December is the best time to go in. The truth was he had filled his quota for August, September, and October, and had someone already lined up for January, so he was just trying to fill the November and December slot. And so I swallowed the hook, line, and sinker and signed up, and I found myself at Lackland Air Force Base on Thanksgiving morning in 1961, and found out the Air Force was on a 4-day vacation. So we wore our civilian clothes, and how well prepared was, the recruiter told us just bring one change of underwear and we'd be fine, So, well, we were pretty smelly bunch after 4 days of wearing the same clothes. I was lucky, my size indicated I needed additional exercise, so they made me a road guard. And another friend that I had friended on that trip, my first airplane ride, was his eyes were a little offset, so the recruiter TI made him a road guard because he was convinced he could see in 2 directions at once.
Oh, that's impressive.
And I finished up basic training there in late December and left for Wichita Falls, the Shepherd Air Force Base, in the 1st of January in 62, and when I got to Shepherd, I was enrolled into helicopter maintenance class, but however, I learned a little bit about administration. The guy above me on the paperwork, he had gotten in a fight, and so when they drew the red line, they drew it through my name rather than his. And so he showed up missing, and they didn't know who I was, and after the first sergeant called out all the names, I'm still standing there, and he says, who are you? And I said, I'm Airman Robinson. He said, well, you're not supposed to be here. So I picked up cigarette butts and rocks for the next 2.5 weeks while they figured out where I should be. And eventually got it sorted out and got me into class. And once I got in class, of course, as I mentioned earlier, my brother-in-law was in the Air Force, and he had just come back from Alaska, and he told me about this new frontier. So when I filled out my dream sheet, I filled it out as going to go to Alaska. And so when the assignment came down, 3 of my classmates went to Alaska, and I went to Altus, Oklahoma. So I knew the Air Force and I were on the same frequency right from the beginning. And when I got to Altus, and that was an interesting trip, and I'm sitting here when I left Shepherd, and I got on a Greyhound bus, and actually it was a trailway, and headed towards Altus, and it says, I stopped in a little town in Texas, and we got off the bus there, and they said, okay, and we were sitting there, and then the next thing you know, they said, bus gate 8 leaving for Altus, Oklahoma, Mangum, and Norman, Oklahoma. So I said, well, I'll go out there, and I go out to gate 8, and there's no bus there. And then I saw a gentleman standing there. I said, where's the bus? He said, that's it. It was a 58 Chevrolet with 4 doors on each side with a trailway written on the side of it. I said, where am I going?
Premonition.
And I crossed over the Red River going into Oklahoma, and the stream was probably a foot wide, but it was a 3.5 mile bridge, and I didn't know until later that the land was so flat that when the rains did come, it would fill up that 3 miles with water. Wow. And so that was my first Red River, and like I said, I was there, and the next thing you know, thinking I'd be there for the rest of my career. Next thing you know, I had an assignment to Osan, Korea, and that's where I headed, to Osan, Korea. And when I got there, after my tour there was getting near the end, I had another one of those dream sheets that put out in front of me, and they says, where would you like to go? So I filled it out, and I just wrote anywhere USA on it and handed it back. And that'll get you a quick trip to the chief's office. So I ended up in the chief's office with the paper in hand, and he gave me the lecture, and that's when I realized that what Will Rogers had said in 1934, there's lies, there's damn lies, and then there's statistics. Because he was explaining to me, coming off a remote tour, that I had a 75% chance of getting the base of choice, and 80% chance of getting the state of choice, and 99% chance of getting the area of choice. So with his careful hands, I filled out my dream sheet as Seymour Johnson in North Carolina, where I came from, and state of Florida, which had 31 bases that had helicopters at that time, and Southeast. And so I just sat back proudly waiting for my assignment to come in, and it was Grand Forks, North Dakota. So, but the chief had already gone.
1%. So when did you get over to Vietnam?
After I got to Grand Forks, when I checked in, they said, by the way, you did know we were closing, and that you need to decide where you want to go from here. And so, I had 3 years in the service at that time. I was just thinking about getting out and starting over, and this wasn't getting very interesting. So before I could, they came down with this assignment in Southeast Asia as a replacement for a group that was already there. Our detachment that we were in was already slated to go to Thailand, and I was being separated from them and going to a different group in Thailand. They left ahead of me, and I beat them over there because they took a 124 and I took a 747, a 727, I guess you might say. And I got over there in April of '65. And the assignment came down, that everything was secret. The word Vietnam was never mentioned. And we were always talking about Indochina, or Southeast Asia.
Southeast Asia.
Nothing about Vietnam. And
where did you fly? What did you fly?
I was a crew chief on a HH-43 rescue helicopter. We were doing LBR work, a local base rescue there in Grand Forks, but I was being transferred over there and where we were actually going to be participating in rescue over North Vietnam. Up to that point, I had 3 years in service, and when I was at Altus, I saw guys disappear, and they'd come back 3 months later, and you'd ask them where they'd been, they wouldn't tell you anything because they just said they'd been out crop dusting. And the same thing when I was in Korea, guys would disappear and come back a couple of months later, and you'd ask them where they'd been, so they'd been out crop dusting. And the same thing in Grand Forks, and
what does that mean?
They couldn't tell you what they'd been doing. It was all classified. And so everybody just classified it as crop dusting. So, you know, like I said, so even when I was in Grant Forest for a short period of time, met guys that just coming back from over there. So I guess it became my turn to go crop dusting, you might say. And you see, you couldn't put where you were going and the APO together, all these different rules and regulations. And I had the opportunity to think about whether I ready, you know, because like I said, I was very fortunate. I came in '61, and most of the troops I was around were World War II and Korean veterans who were getting towards the end of their career, and you know, and we had some good discussions, and you know, and about where the future of the Air Force was concerned. Well, one of the big topics of conversation in '61 or '62, when I got to my first base, was the Bay of Pigs, and one of the first things I learned that the Bay of Pigs was just a total screw up because of lack of communication among each other, as well as the different branches of service, as well as a communication with the government. And I was very proud of our president. He took full responsibility and never tried to blame anybody else for his own lack of knowledge, and we moved on as a better thing. And I was on active duty during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I saw everything that was needed to be done was done, and within 72 hours of missiles being located on the island of Cuba, they were put back in that box and sent back to Russia, because we had deployed all over the world, and we were ready under Kennedy's leadership to put an end to this in an instant. And I was in Korea when our president was assassinated. Again, I saw these old guys, the World War II and the Korean guys, kind of calm the waters and say, hey, let's figure out what's going on. Let's don't go out shooting each other. Let's just go ahead and see what's going on. And sure enough, after everything came to light, you know, we had a smooth transition into the new president. And I guess that I was influenced by him, because the first words I remember him saying was, I'm not going to send American boys to do what Asian boys should do for themselves. Well, lo and behold, he won the election, and in 3 years, he went from basically 10,000 troops in Southeast Asia to up over 600,000. So I guess that's how politicians look at things, that you just misunderstood me. And so I left, and like I said, prepared for what was going on. I didn't know exactly, you know, as I jokingly tell people, I said I wasn't sure where I was going, wasn't sure where I was when I got there, but I knew we did it all on borrowed money. It made me feel like a Democrat. So once we got there, we were briefed on what we were doing, and that we were an outpost. You know, we were basically 7 miles from what is considered hostile territory, and as we were as close as we could get. We were at a Royal Thai Air Force base in the northwest corner of Thailand. And our responsibility was, if an airplane got shot up and hopefully made it back to some area, we could go in and rescue him and get him, dust him off, give him a beer, and send him back to work. But that was essentially what our responsibility was. We realized that what we had wasn't the best thing in the world, but it was all we had. We took an LBR airplane, which stands for Local Base Rescue, and turned it into a combat airplane with a piece of quarter-inch steel underneath the pilot and the co-pilot seat, and we sat on our World War II flak vest in the back. We took note that it was a limited fuel airplane, so we had to create more range. So we had introduced the first in-flight refueling for helicopters back in the '64 and '65, with basically a 55-gallon barrel and 2 quick disconnection of garden hose. And basically one of my responsibilities as crew chief is, once we burn off enough fuel from the main tank, was to flip those tanks over and get the quick disconnection of hose together and drain it into the main tank. And once that was complete, is to retrieve the quick disconnection of garden hose and get rid of the 55-gallon barrel. So according to unofficial Air Force history, I got credit for 2 bombings over North Vietnam with a 55-gallon barrel. And I'm sure that the people, when they saw a barrel coming at them from 10,000 feet, were probably trying to get out of the way of it. You know, and like I said, we flew several missions. We had other responsibilities, and of course, we were in that mode, and we couldn't tell anybody where we were. And you know, and the funny part to me was all the guys that had girlfriends and wives back home said, "Honey, you'll never have to worry about me. These are some of the ugliest women you've ever seen in your life," you know. And lo and behold, in 1965, Miss Universe happened to be Miss Thailand. Well,
Yeah.
when they were working, you know, like I said, they didn't work in makeup and high heel shoes
Right, of course,
and fingernails,
of course.
you know.
Right.
But once they got off work, they
Dressed
cleaned up and looked and
Yep.
dressed up. So.
Yep, of course, beautiful women.
First we were over there for a 3-month TDY, and we were scheduled to come back home in July of '65. But the Air Force had decided it was going to change the HH-43 to a CH-3 airplane, and so they brought 2 of the CH-3s that were already on board and brought them in to replace us. And unfortunately, they had mechanical issues that had to be dealt with, and so we were extended for the duration. And like I said, we were excited when they came in because we helped them put them together, and we were watching when they flew the first time and said, you know, we had our bags packed in the locker room, in our bedrooms, ready to go. But unfortunately, they started having issues, and because they had made no replacements for us, and we were the end of the 43 era, we were extended, and we flew along with them. We flew when they couldn't fly, and we made ourselves available, and we kind of tag teamed there until September, and like I said, and on the 20th of September, we were still flying missions along with the CH-3s, and we went on this particular mission because the C-3 had an additional problem that they were dealing with, and so we took it on, and basically we went in there, and once we got in the area, we had so many rules of engagement that just made it it was almost like a car club kind of trying to run a show, you know, trying to line up cars into the order, you know, well, this we're going to get the old ones before the new ones. Nobody could make a decision. Everything that was made, decisions were being made in the basement of the White House. And you know, this was the kind of the personal touch that LBJ put on the war, was that it was his war and he was going to run it his way, and that was the end of that. And so once we got into the area and set up our search and had communicated with the pilot, and we were proceeding down we were up at 10,000 feet and came down through the soup. We went through 3,000 feet of soup, which was cloudy weather where you can't see anything. You just fall out on the bottom side and hope there's nothing there but you. Yeah, it makes your little butt pucker when you're going through stuff like that, you know. And so once we got out in the clearing, you know, it was still light rain, but we could see where we were going, and our radar on board picked up right his location because he had a beeper with him, and we could home in on him, and we just went in and set up our recovery grid, and like I said, we were in a hover above him, and unfortunately, he was in such a location on the hillside, we had to get away from the hill so we could swing the cable up to him because we didn't have enough to drop it straight down to him, which was 90 feet. The airplane has 100 foot of cable, and the last 10 feet of it is painted red, and I'm holding red cable, so I know I got everything I've got hanging underneath the airplane, and then next thing you know, one of our escort airplanes that were suppressing the firepower around the area, they took a hit in the rocket pod, and the last transmission we heard over the radio was unauthorized disposal of the ordnance in the local area. So they had to abandon us in the middle of a rescue mission, according to the White House, and go out to the ocean and jettison the rocket pods so as not to harm anyone, but that could have been used to suppress the firepower we were facing because we were essentially unarmed. And so no more than they got out the area, then all hell broke loose, and we fell 90 feet to the jungle floor, and the pilot had just reached a donut that I was swinging underneath the airplane. I'd swung it up to him, and by the time he grabbed the donut, we started taking hits. And fortunate for us, the helicopter, everything is above you. You got the engine, transmission, rotor blades. If they'd been shooting up at us, I wouldn't be here today. But being as they were shooting down at us, the rotor blades, the transmission, and the engine all took the hits rather than our bodies underneath, and then the bullets were ricocheting off of that rather than us. But once we started chopping bamboo, that was the end of us. And I found out the wooden blades on the H-43 are just no match for bamboo. And so we fell essentially about 90 feet with no blades. We were just a box descending down. And like I said, I call my day of miracles because, like I said, there's no way I should have survived being shot at like that we were, except from the fact that the angle in which they were shooting. And then to fall 90 feet in a box and walk away was, was a miracle in itself, And if we'd have landed on something hard like the concrete or asphalt, we probably wouldn't have survived. But the jungle floor offered such a cushion that the airplane just kind of settled down in it, and like I said, we had to cut our way out of the airplane to get away from it. We all four got out.
Okay.
Unfortunately, we got separated because of the conditions, and our co-pilot, when they captured us, they didn't know about him, and so he was able to evade and got out of the area. And he was captured in Laos, and he spent 2 years in captivity in Laos. And during an escape attempt, he was killed. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Rescue Dawn, but the second character in that was my co-pilot. And
have they made a movie about you yet?
Pardon me?
Have they made a movie about you yet?
No. No, they got too many more subjects to go through.
No, we got to hop on that.
But
right, so you got separated. He ends up going a different way. He gets captured in Laos, and then ends up. He was in captivity for 2 years, and then an escape attempt. He gets killed at that point. And then the three of you got.
The three of us
right
plus the pilot, we got captured at the same time. Mm-hmm. And we had, the rules of engagement, we had to get at least a half mile away from the airplane because within 30 minutes they're going to come in and blow it up so that nothing fell in enemy hands. And and so that was our purpose. And we got a half mile away, and it was still daylight. And we decided we found what we felt was a good hiding place, and we were waiting for darkness to fall, and then we would continue on westward and hopefully make it back into Thailand. But unfortunately, as we were in hiding, you could hear the voices around us, and eventually it was enough of them. When we looked out, there was probably 100+ people standing there with machine guns and machetes, and the pilot looked at myself and Airman Black and said, "Live to fight another day." And we were taken into captivity at that point, and then later on, the pilot we were trying to rescue was joined up with us. And we were taken down out of the mountains, and in the beginning they treated us reasonable. I mean, you still got language barriers, and to us, at that time I was a 250-pound man. The co-pilot, the pilot was probably 185 pounds, and the other guy we were pretty big compared to Vietnamese, and so they were a lot of curiosity seekers because they'd never seen anybody as big as we were, you might say, because they just didn't travel in their circles. And so we were put out on static display, and we were very comfortable there for a while. And all of a sudden, the blowhorn showed up, and they started, I guess, to the hate and discontent like you see sometimes in our local news. Is somebody shows up with a blowhorn and gets people riled up, and next thing you know, they're beating the hell out of us, and and that wasn't good enough for them, so they just moved us on to another village, and the same thing would reoccur. That was my introduction to Vietnam, you know, and then.
How many missions had you flown up until this point?
Pardon me?
How many missions, did you fly a lot of missions before?
No,
Or was this your first mission?
No, I think I'd flown 4 different ones.
Okay.
Some were
And then you
successful
got
and some of
shut
them weren't.
Okay,
And plus like I said, we had other responsibilities.
right,
We'd gone in and picked up some Vietnamese who had been shot up, but had moved into a safe zone, and we bring them back and things. But as far as the aircrew members, we were just different things. Yeah. Put on public just like a prize trophy. You know, you've seen the boys from the local neighborhood drive through with their deer hanging out the back of the truck. You know, this is kind of the way we were treated. You know, I might tell you, as a prize trophy. But I guess that got old after a couple of days, and I think the first thing that one morning they took me out, and like I said, I'm blindfolded, my hands are tied behind my back, and my wrists are tied together, my feet are tied in such a point that you have to shuffle. You know, you couldn't really take a step, but I could lean back and I could see underneath the mask that I had a hat on, and I could see that there was a crowd there, and all of a sudden, you know, there was just unusual noise, and then quietness, and when I looked down, I was looking at a freshly dug grave, and I was convinced at that point that the life that I knew was over. And as the guy started to speaking, I know, you know, I just, in my own mind, I visioned my own trial, you know, that I was being, basically being, my charges were being read, and then their findings were being read, and next thing you know, I was sitting there expecting, you know, sentence to be execution. And as this went on, you know, I'm sitting there, but basically just counting my breaths as to how many more, and I was just thinking about, you know, that I was going to be buried on this hill right here, and then nobody'd ever know where I was. And you know, that was, I had made my peace with my maker. You know, I always jokingly say that I invented the speed dial, because I had him on the line the whole time. Hey, things ain't going good here, you need some help, you know. And sure enough, somebody else spoke up from a different area, and it's just like everything stopped. And the 2 guards that were standing behind me, and I could see from the shadows that their weapons were pointed at me. They lowered their weapons, and each one of them, one on the other, one on each arm, lifted me back up and took me back to my cell. And I knew from that point on I was going to survive. I didn't have any idea what was going to happen, but I said, I felt like I had a sign sent to me from above, said, this is going to be all right. Yeah. Whether it was real or mock, I don't know. But to me, it was very real. Of course. But whether they just intended to scare the hell out of me, well, they succeeded. They scared heaven right into my life. From that point on, I never had a fear of not making it. You know, in a couple of days, they took me out and marched me around the neighborhood, and every once in a while I'd see a camera, and they'd pop out and take a picture, you know. Of course, I'm trying to raise my head, because they always told you your chance of survival was to be seen. And so I was looking into the camera every time, and they finally put enough knots on the back of my head that I realized they wanted me to hold my head down. And that's how that picture ended up being taken. And it turned out, I learned later, that was Ho Chi Minh's personal photographer, who was on vacation down in that area, and he was called in to take that picture. So I felt his pain as he was trying to get that one shot. You know, if they ever produced a picture of it, they'd have to produce you at the end of the war. And so you want to make sure that picture was recognizable, you know, and that was.
And so when you did that, they would hit you on the head so that to train you not to do that.
Yeah. But I was able to get enough that they were able to recognize it. And then, you know, like I said, finish up later, that stamp was used on several different occasions. I never got credit for being an airman. One time I was shot down as a naval officer, next time I was shot down as a Marine Corps officer, but they knew they just happened to have this picture on board, you know. they made I would say that they made a collection of stamps from 500 to 4,500. And for every 500 airplanes shot down over the north, they would produce a stamp. And I just happened to be on stamp number 2000. And of course, they claimed to have shot down 4,100 F-105s, and we didn't build but 623 combat models. So, you know, just a little fuzzy math here and there. But that's the only thing ever come about it. They said, would you like to be on an American stamp? I said, no. They said, why? I said, we only put dead folks on ours. I wasn't in a hurry for that one. But we were eventually, after the picture was taken and all this stuff, we were turned over to the regular military, and it was pretty much no nonsense from that point on. We spent 7 days traveling up the main road and till we got to Hanoi. And then once we got to Hanoi, you know, probably about a block from what we now know as the Hanoi Hilton, they pulled off our blindfolds so we could see the broken, see the 25-foot high walls with the broken glass and concertina wire that was on top of it. And I can remember one of the guards saying home, and of course, I'm thinking San Francisco and he's thinking Hilton, so we were about 12,000 miles off, you know. And, but I realized when we got up to the front door, they opened the door and we walked through the first door, and when we went through the second door, all four of us at one time, I didn't see my pilot again for 7 years. We were separated at that point, and I didn't see my pilot or the guy we were trying to rescue for 7 years. So we just went in different directions during that time. I was taken through a maze of hallways and ended up in what I now know is New Guy Village, which is a small cell back in the far corners of the Hilton, and it was small enough I could stretch my arms out in either direction and touch the outside wall. The only thing in it was a bed that was about 14 to 16 inches wide, about 4.5 feet tall, or 4.5 feet long, and a little bucket at the end of it. We had a transom above the door, but we were nowhere near daylight anywhere. And well, the Vietnamese wore, we call them fancy shower clogs, but you could hear them coming for, you know, for several feet, you know, when they flip-flops. And no more had they gotten out of the area, and you didn't hear the noise, and a voice rang out identifying himself as Colonel Robinson Reisner, the senior ranking prisoner of war at that time. And his first words to me as a 22-year-old was, "Be prepared to die for your country." I wasn't quite prepared for those words, but I understood what he was saying, you know, so, you know, then he came back and he said, if we survive, we must return with honor. So that became our battle cry, you might say, return with honor. And so that's what we strive from day one to live up to, is death or return with honor. And that's, one other thing he did say was learn the tap code. Well, we had the tap code. In fact, there's a book just came out in regards to tap code by Smitty Harris, who's the one that brought the tap code into the prison camp. Basically, all it is you take the alphabet, and you drop the K out of it and use a C in the place of K, and you got a square of 25. So when you're tapping, you identify the row from top to bottom. So you tap, if you wanted to send a C, for instance, you tap one time to identify the first row, and then 3 taps would identify the third letter on the first row. So, and a Z would be essentially 5 taps to identify the 5th row, and 5 more taps to identify the last letter on the 5th row. You can see how that was much simpler than the standard. A was 1 tap and Z was 26. So, you know, it took a while to communicate under those circumstances. And the walls in the prison camp were, you know, it was a full-fledged prison. It wasn't, you know, just a makeshift thing. And basically, you couldn't use Morse code through it because you just couldn't get a tap and a swipe. You know, like you can use the tap for the dot and the swipe for the dash, but you just couldn't hear it through the wall. So that was the reason we needed something a little bit better. And we used that cap code until the day we left. And it was used in various forms. We used it when we were chopping wood or when you were out sweeping in the yard. We were all convinced that it wasn't going to be a very long war. And so the most important mission we had at hand was know who was there so that we could ensure accountability when we were released. And that was our guideline. I mean, later on, of course, we used it for what we call plums, which are our directives. You know, like I said, we had our rules and regulations and our leadership and everything, and we became a full-fledged, military organization made up of different members of. We had an army, had some army, mostly Navy, Marine Corps, and Air Force, and Marine Corps, and so we, like I said, we had to have some sort of organization, and our seniors willfully took command, and so this was a prime means of communication. I guess, after things had settled down, I'd only been there a few hours, and next thing you know, they come in and ordered me to remove everything I had, and so they took everything I owned. So I got my first opportunity in Hanoi to stand there in my birthday suit, and the next thing you know, they opened up the peephole and they shoved in a short shirt, a long shirt, a short pair of pants, a long pair of pants, much like pajamas with a drawstring, a bar of soap, a toothbrush, a toothpaste, and a mosquito net, a blanket, and a washcloth, and a metal cup. And of course, as they were giving us, I was setting them down on a small bed. And as I looked at those things, the first time I realized that they would be my worldly possessions for the next 8 Thanksgivings, 8 Christmases, and 8 New Years that I'd ring in captivity. Eventually, we learned that the Hilton was just a processing center at that point. And so once we got processed in, and they had different places. But their problem was just like ours. They weren't convinced it was going to be a long war, so they weren't making any preparations for prisoners of war. And they were still trying to keep us in solitary confinement all at the same time, And like I said, I was very fortunate. I only spent about 8 months in solitary confinement, where some guys spent over 4 years. And so, all of mine wasn't all at one time. So, it was, you could survive it. You might say you didn't like it, but you survived it. And eventually we were moved out of there to the zoo. And once I got in the zoo, and we had encouraging words from new shoot downs, and whenever we get in contact with a new shoot down, they would say, we'd say, how's the war going? They would say, wouldn't last 3 more months, we'd be out of here before Christmas. And so, we had a kind of a goal, we'll just hang on for 3 more months and we'll get out of here. I adopted what I referred to as a 3-day stay. Yesterday I was shot down, today's today, and tomorrow I'm going home. So I only had 1 day to work with to be prepared to go home. And so that helped me in my mental and physical state throughout my captivity. Even though you get up that morning and say, well, I got to do this again tomorrow, but you kept going. And probably the most devastating news we got, was we had what we call Hanoi Hannah. She was just a Vietnamese that, spoke good English. And one day she played a tape from Robert McNamara when he announced to the world that the prisoners of war were expendable. We, in our own mind, kind of brushed it over, saying, well, but then we started thinking about how our families felt when the man that was in charge of the war labeled their son, their father, their brother, their friend as expendable. Robert McNamara tried to brush it over. They browbeat our families to not to say anything. In fact, you have my telegram that the government sent and encouraged my family not to divulge information that I was missing in action. And that's the thought process of the Johnson administration. They didn't care. And this was another one of the Johnson's I don't care situation. McNamara did take our families and say, well, we're trying to get the pressure off of them so that they can not be held responsible, and of course, too late by then. But, you know, it's, he was just simple labeled as expendable. But reality, the purpose was to get us off the front pages of the newspaper. And as a result of that, you know, the press swallowed it hook, line, and sinker. And next thing you know, we went from front page to back page and didn't make the newspaper at all because, you know, the government was going along. I mean, the newspapers were going along with the government at that time. And it's kind of like what we got now. And, you know, it's okay. Wake up, America. But shortly thereafter, I moved out, and we moved out what we call the Bry Patch, and we stayed out there for about 18 months. And this was probably the worst conditions that I experienced in captivity because we were in solitary and semi-solitary confinement. We had no running water, no electricity, and we were fed early in the morning, late in the afternoon, and we were hogtied the rest of the day. And we spent about 5 months with being hogtied, you know, every day, you know, and the Vietnamese, we'd have to ask them permission to go to the bathroom, so they would come and untie us, and some guards would and some guards wouldn't. And, you know, like I said, they enjoyed watching you soil your clothes, knowing you didn't have any way to wash them or anything like that. They just another way to humiliate you, you know, as far as life goes on, and we overcame it. And during that period of time, they had what they call the Hanoi March, which is well publicized. And they marched a group of Americans through the streets of Hanoi, much like they did us months before. And they got the hell beat out of them. And of course, the guards got beaten too. And of course, it created an uprising in the United States. And the Vietnamese said, well, they had already stated that we would all be tried and most likely be executed at the end of the war, so that didn't go very well. And then they came out with another statement, you know, saying that all of us would enter re-education camp, and if we would be re-educated and ask for forgiveness of our sins, then we would be allowed to return home at the end of the war. So we went through the re-education at the camp where they come in and beat the living hell out of us and then asked us what we thought. And finally they organized themselves, and the first thing they did is come in and they wanted us to choose one or two ways, that of the Johnson administration or the American people who were against the war. So lo and behold, we made the wrong choice. So they come in and beat the hell out of us again, so we'd re-choose. And some of us went two or three times having to retake our choices, you know. and finally, you know, they wanted us to write confessions and things like that. And you know, we did everything humanly possible to keep that from happening. And in fact, most of us, well, it's amazing how many different airplanes that Clark Kent and Ben Casey and all those guys flew during the Vietnam War, you know. I remember being called in one time, wanting to know who this Clark Kent fellow was, you know, and I said, he's a Roman ambassador. What do you mean? I said, well, he goes out and checks the morale of the troops. He'll fly with the Navy for a little while, and then he'll go fly with the Air Force, and then he'll go fly with the Marine Corps and spend some time with the Army just checking the morale of the troops. So that's, they never did figure out who Clark Kent was. But anybody that would read anything that was printed, right. We used all the TV characters, like I said, Red Button, and just anybody we could think of that in what we were forced to write, so that anybody reading it would know it was pure garbage, you know. And of course, the biggest problem, they weren't interested in what we in America thought. They were more interested in their people. And that's the stamp. On the stamp it says the man and the mouse, to indicate that to the Vietnamese women, you could do this too, you know, as far as, you know, capturing the big American. Of course, in their book, history book, it says that I was a heavily armed airman walking down the Vietnamese road, and she reminded my sister, so rather than shoot her, I surrendered to her. And I said, no, she had 100 friends with her that had everything from machine guns to machetes. And I thought it was a good idea to live to fight another day. So, I mean, you know, two different interpretations of the same film. In fact, I was down in Gulfport, Mississippi one time, and I showed this to a gentleman there, and I said, I see you're retired military. He said, how do you do? I said, well, it just shows. And he said, yeah, I've been out 90 days. And I showed him my stamp. He had just come back he was at the attaché office in North Vietnam. And I showed him that picture, and he went back and showed it to his wife, who was actually North Vietnamese. And she came out and she was just thrilled, and she told about reading me in Vietnamese history books. She said, I know you, I studied you in history.
Over in North Vietnam?
Yeah.
Wow.
And so she was all excited, and of course she had some South Vietnamese working in the back for her, and she went back down and showed it to the South Vietnamese. They didn't have a clue what she was talking about. Well, you know, we went through a lot of events. You know, like I said, we went through, in '68, we moved back to civilization. We moved into a room of 7 to 8 people, and this was our first glimpse of hope, you might say, at something. We always looking for optimism. We said, well, they've just put us together so we wouldn't look spastic when we went home. You know, so that was our first. And then shortly after that, then President Johnson stopped the bombing of North Vietnam. And, you know, like I said, if you'd have been listening, you could have heard us scream in San Francisco because we were so excited. And then we realized it was just another ploy by the Johnson administration to try to get Humpty Dumpty elected, and basically trying to mislead the American people that the war was over. But what it did to us, it took away our lifeline. Because when he stopped the bombing, not that we want anybody to get shot down, but we wanted at least to be able to talk to him if he did get here, you know, and they kept us abreast of what was going on. And a lot of these guys knew each other before they were ever shot down. They went through training together, and so they, you know, the guys kept up with information about their families. And some guys, when they get shot down, say, hey, you got so-and-so up here? And say, yeah, I had a letter from his wife for about 2 months ago, and she and the kids are all doing fine. So these were things that Johnson took away from us by stopping the bombing. We lost that contact with the outside world for 3 years. And the word expendable was very plentiful in our life. And of course, then we went through the change of management, you might say, and we were all very hopeful. And I guess the thing that we saw that was different was the day after Nixon was elected, the Vietnamese were out there digging foxholes because they knew he was coming. They didn't know when, but they knew that he had made it clear that he was coming if they didn't set forth some efforts. And but the Vietnamese got a little better to us. We were, see, in the beginning, Vietnam had signed the Geneva Convention on the treatment of prisoners of war. And of course, their claim was they were treating us better than they would have treated prisoners of war, which turned out to be a total lie. And so the International Red Cross, because they weren't allowed to inspect the prison camps, would not release International Red Cross packages to us, so nothing was released. The American Red Cross, being what it is, tried. They sent packages to North Vietnam for us until they found them on dead North Vietnamese soldiers in South Vietnam. And so they quit sending in. And then after the bombing had stopped, and then Ho Chi Minh allowed our families to send us a small care package. And those care packages were simple things like a t-shirt, a handkerchief, Kool-Aid, coffee, tea, and things of that nature, and just a little small care package. It started out in Vietnam, you know, at home, it started out with 6 pounds, but by the time we got it, it was probably a pound, you know. In fact, my dad and stepmother got accused of espionage because supposedly the tube of toothpaste they sent me had a radio in it. You know, my daddy said, there wasn't no damn radio in that thing when I left my house. I don't know who put that damn radio in there.
Crazy.
But, you know, there's things like that. And,
Is there a flag?
but we found out, you know, how well we were cut off from the outside world. The way we found out that Neil Armstrong had walked on the moon years and years ago, much when you weren't even a child yet. They used to be on when you went into a restaurant, the sugar packs on the thing used to have bits of history on the back of them. And somebody sent a picture of Neil Armstrong stepping out on the moon on the back of one of those sugar packs. And that's how we found out Neil Armstrong had walked on the moon. We knew something had happened, but the Russians in their pictorial had said something about they wouldn't recognize we'd put a man up there, but they were more about the technology that they had landed on the moon to gather information. They never mentioned that we'd sent a man up there and took a sample and brought it back. You know, they'd send a machine up there to send back information. So we knew something had happened, but it was a year after that before we finally found it out. And, you know, like I said, we saw differences after Nixon took office. But the real change came in 1970, on November 20th, when a group of guys who had been training, President Nixon had been briefed on Son Tay. Son Tay was much like the briar patch that I had been in, 40 miles outside of Hanoi in isolation, that it was easy to go in and, like I said, the simplest thing, if you saw the Bin Laden raid, you saw the Son Tay raid. Same principle. We just crash landed a helicopter in the compound, secured the area, blew a hole in the wall, brought in reinforcements, started looking for prisoners of war. Much the same thing they did with Bin Laden. And so that was the Bin Laden raid was a exact duplicate. And that was pulled off on the 20th of November 1970. And those guys were heartbroken, thinking what a failure they had been. They took a moment out of their difficulty and cried, thinking what they had not accomplished. And they came home, you know, you might say in many ways that they were criticized by, even John McCain said that wasn't a successful mission. And I've been brokenhearted ever since that he would say such a thing, but he did. And it was very disappointing. But they didn't get the mission they went after, but they changed our lives. As a result of that raid, the Vietnamese changed the label of expendable to high value. And the Hanoi Hilton, which we were only using less than 20% of, all of a sudden, they went in with a can of whitewash and they cleaned that prison. They moved out all the political prisoners. They moved out all of the female prisoners being held there. And they cleaned it all out and whitewashed it, and we all moved in there. And guys that had been in solitary confinement for over 4 years all of a sudden walked in a room with 40 other guys. And so we saw our life change overnight, that just from the word expendable by the Johnson administration to high value under the Nixon administration. And like I said, probably 40 guys that would not have survived another 2 years under conditions that we were living under got to come home and live a full life with their families. So they've always been our heroes as far as when we look back at individual actions that directly affected us. It was these Son Tay Raiders, which were made up of all branches of service and dedicated to duty. They built the prison camp at Eglin Air Force Base and tore it up every day and put it back the next day, because the Russians had a satellite in the air and they flew over that area every day. So they had to make it look like nothing had happened and put it back and start all over the next day. And they did that for about 4 months until they told them they were ready. And President Nixon gave them the green light on it. So we are honored to know these men and know their capabilities and willingness to put everything on the line for us. And you know, we don't want them to get lost in the history books. They are real heroes as far as we're concerned. Once you know, we were moved into the rooms, and like I said, we got to know each other, and the Vietnamese tried to identify their leadership, and our leadership said no. And we stood up to the Vietnamese, and we felt emboldened at that point that we should. And as a result of us bowing up, you know, at first they didn't take to the idea that our senior ranking officers, but they eventually came to our way of thinking as they went through some rooms 4 and 5 deep, dragging out the senior ranking officers. The next one stood up, and they knew that we were willing to go to the end. And as a result of that, they started to recognize our seniors, and that it made an improvement for everybody. You know, that we were less hostile towards them, and they were less hostile towards us. And you know, and not that we gained any respect, but we just gained some understanding of what was expected of us, and that's the way we went. And going back to the story of the first American flag, is we had a young man, Mike Christensen, from a little town outside of Selma, Alabama. You know, he grew up in an era when you could be poor and still have an American flag, you know, and be proud of your country. You know, but you didn't have everything you wanted. But, you know, Mike was 13 years old when he got his first new pair of shoes. And in fact, when he was 17, he conned his mother into signing for him to join the Navy so he could help the family. And eventually he became a flight officer and was shot down over the north. But his feelings were that he grew up in a home that had a flag, and his home now needed a flag, and Mike gathered material from wherever he could. And in the back of that long sleeve shirt I mentioned earlier, he donned the first American flag that was ever flown in North Vietnam. It was makeshift, but it was American made, you might say, from foreign materials, but it was an American flag. And Mike was in the room, and you know, and like I said, Senator McCain was in the room at that time, and describes the moment when Mike unfurled that flag and that he had sewn in the back of his long sleeve shirt, and decided how that all of them just stopped in amazement and stood at attention and rendered a salute and recited the Pledge of Allegiance together. And that day on, Mike secured that flag until, you know, one day the Vietnamese came in on a surprise inspection and found that flag, and they went absolutely ballistic. And Mike, being the type of person he was, identified himself as the maker of the flag so that no one else could get hurt. And no more he had identified himself, he caught a rifle bullet across the back of the head, and he sprawled out in front of his roommates. And as they stepped forward to try to help Mike, the Vietnamese locked and loaded and grabbed Mike and drug him out of the room feet first. And in the distance, we could hear as Mike was being beaten, just for the purpose of, you know, because he had wanted an American flag to share with his roommates. Eventually, Mike was brought back, according to McCain, near death. And basically, with cold water and a washcloth and prayer, they nursed Mike back to health. And he was famously for saying one day he just sat up in the middle of his bed with a grin from ear to ear and said, "Time for flag number 2." And that's some of the words we used that were part of America. Never give up, never give in, roll with the punches, bounce back, get ready for the next round. And that's what we are all about. You know, it's not how many times you go down, it's just how many times you get up is what makes America different from the rest of the world. And as a result of that, many other flags were made by different people in a clandestine manner throughout the prison camps. That became a trend. President Nixon had been negotiating all this time. You see, Johnson, he had said that he wasn't going to send American boys to do what Asian boys should do for himself. But in less than 3 years, he had 600,000 troops in combat zone, you know. And President Nixon, when he took office, he just did what Johnson said he was going to. He's going to Vietnamize the war. And essentially, as the Vietnamese stood up, America stood down. And by the end of 1972, we had reduced our forces to somewhere around 20,000 combat troops in South Vietnam, with the end to the war at hand, and they were negotiating in Washington D.C. and the issue of POWs came up, and the Vietnamese said, just go in the house, we'll take care of that later. President Nixon said, no, we'll take care of it now. And of course, the reason for it is that there were French prisoners of French Foreign Legions that were captured in 1954 that did not get released until 1979. So he wasn't going to allow, and nor would the American people allow us to pull out of Vietnam, unlike Afghanistan, and leave Americans behind. And as a result of that action, the Vietnamese stormed out of the conference table, and President Nixon unleashed what is referred to as linebacker 2. In a period of 11 days, starting on the 18th of December 1917, we dropped more bombs than has ever been dropped in the history of mankind. And it was not to advance the war, but to secure the freedoms of 591 Americans being held in captivity at that particular time. And as a result of that, the Vietnamese came back to the peace table, and an honorable end was signed on the 26th of January 1973. So anyway, the bombing of the North, and like I said, in a period of 11 days, we dropped more bombs than has ever been dropped in the history of mankind. Not to advance the war, but to secure the freedoms of 591 known Americans. I think about that night, I think about the first guy to die that night was Walter Ferguson. He was a tail gunner on a B-52. He had already had his paperwork in and was ready to go back to retire in February of 1973. But he chose to fly on this mission. That's one of the proudest things I can say about the end of the Vietnam War. As far as the Air Force was concerned, not a single non-volunteer broke ground. All of those wanted to come and bring their brothers home. And as a result of that, the mission was accomplished. And I think about Walter Ferguson. He and I had at Altus, Oklahoma together back in 1962. Whether we ever met or not, I don't know. But I know that he was a B-52 tail gunner, and I was a helicopter crew chief, and I'm sure I probably saw him soaring into the air, not knowing that 10 years later he was going to give his life for the freedoms that I enjoy today. And so he was just one of the 40 that lost their life during that 10-day period, or 11 days, that ensured the freedoms that I have enjoyed these past 60 years, you might say, or actually 50 years. But once the peace talks were settled, Vietnamese came back, and then on the 12th of February, we were homeward bound with the first groups of Americans breaking ground and coming home. And we were brought back. They didn't know what they were getting, so the airplanes were well prepared, and a lot of people don't know to this day that they had straitjackets on board, and they had litters, they had whatever they needed. They felt that they were going into an unknown, but their effort was to bring American heroes in their mind home, and that's what they did. And and once we got into friendly hands, a friend of mine was asked, could you define freedom? And he simply responded that doors with inside knobs. And each time you think about how many opportunities we have just because we can open the door and walk through it. And that's where that comes from. To me, as far as I always say I got the heroes welcome that belong to some of the guys that you were interviewing on here. I can't imagine how they felt when they landed on American soil and there's someone standing there telling them to remove their uniform as not to offend anyone. I can't imagine them being spit upon as though they were just common criminals. They were America's sons and daughters that were asked to do something, and they did it well. They weren't the group that run to Canada, and I always say to me, one of the saddest moments is when we forgave those who ran before we as a nation stood up and said thank you to those who served. And we live out the rest of the story. You know, we had a few cowards that went to Canada, but Canada sent us 5 times as many as we sent them, that they stood with our brothers and sisters on the battlefield. And so, you know, 3 shouts out for Canada and what they did for us during this period of time. They stood beside us when our own American brothers would not. And, you know, when you think in terms of losses, you know, we think about, over 58,000 dead, over 1,500 still missing in action, unaccounted for. They joined some 83,000 other Americans from other wars that had not been accounted for that we need to make an effort to make. We have over 300,000 injuries. And one of the things that I find interesting that, when we talk about all the dismemberment and the loss of arms, legs, that, you know, in both Iraq and Afghanistan, we're talking about 2,500 people. But in Vietnam, we're talking about 5,500 people that lost limbs in Vietnam, and nobody ever speaks of that. When they think about the, over 58,000 dead, nobody mentions the fact that 39,000 of them were 22 and under. 36,000 of them were 19 and under. And so these things get lost in transition. 20,000 kids grew up without a father. You know, me personally, when I look at it, only 1 out of 5 air crew members shot down over Southeast Asia survived. So I can truly say I'm one of the luckiest men alive. You know, you get on the political end of it, you know, as Johnson said, if I've lost McNamara, what's his name? Walter Cronkite, I've lost the war. And Walter Cronkite described the Tet Offensive in 1968 when we killed, wounded, and captured nearly 45,000 North Vietnamese soldiers, and we lost 100 brave men. Cronkite labeled that as a defeat for America. And no wonder we couldn't win. We won every battle, but we couldn't win the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese people. The reason we couldn't is because they were able to convince their people we were going to do the same thing the French did, colonize them, take all their wealth, and move on. And that's a sad part as far as that is concerned.
I have a question for you, just change it up a little bit. How did your parents handle your POW status?
They didn't do too well. My mother, of course, she died when I was 14, but my dad, he was supposed to have had a nervous breakdown, so that just gave him the right to go into my bank account and clean it out. So rather than having X amount of money to come home to, I had less than X, about half. So I was only working for 33 cents an hour, so he took half of that. So I guess I averaged out to make 15 cents an hour while I was in captivity. But I'm still here to bitch about it, so I win. As my father-in-law from my first marriage said, the best way to get even is to outlive the bastards. So I work on that. Unfortunately, I don't think they felt that I was going to survive, so therefore they just didn't want that money to pile up, and they've been sitting on top of it, and me come take it away from them, so they went ahead and spent their fair share. Oh yeah, they, we all went through extensive debriefing, and we constantly, get called upon. In fact, some of the prisoners of war have run survival, schools throughout the United States. Doug Hagel was a Navy chief that fell off a ship, and he became the survival instructor down at San Diego for many years before. And I think he left, actually retired as a Navy chief. He did the job as a civilian, and so all of us have been called upon to write, rewrite, and reevaluate the code of conduct, and as far as making sure that our young men and women today have the best opportunity to survive under difficult circumstances.
Were you a POW at the same time as Jeremiah Denton?
Yes. And Jeremiah Denton was shot down, I think it was June the 14th, 1965, and I was shot down in September. So Admiral Stockdale was the one I was closest to. Admiral Stockdale and Colonel Robbie Reisner both were shot down in September, the same month I was shot down. The three ranking guys when I got there was Jeremiah Denton, Admiral Stockdale, and Robbie Reisner.
Were there any of the South Vietnamese Army POWs with you, or was it just U.S.?
No, we had, that's where we can call ourselves the 4th Combined Allied Wing, because we did have Laotian, Thai, and we did have one South Vietnamese that was in our group that were in our prison camp. And we considered World War I as the 1st Allied Wing, World War II is the 2nd, Korea is 3rd, and we took on the title of the 4th Combined Allied Wing for Vietnam. And so it was our own creation, you might say. But everybody lived with it after we got back, so we didn't have to make any changes.
So was the most of your communication amongst the POWs just, you're talking to each other through the walls?
We found well, the Vietnamese referred to us as a group of magicians, because like I said, that we would try to talk over the walls. We devised hand code, and eventually we had someone that had knew the mute stuff, and so we used that in a kind of an awkward way. But we had different signs we could make A and B, and we would stand on somebody's shoulders, and we could go from one building to the next to a little peephole at the top of the building. And then when they discovered that, they built the wall higher, so we couldn't do that. So we just we drilled a hole and put a note in the wall. And then we just communication was our lifeline, and we weren't going to let them stop it. They would try to interfere. They'd sit there and bang on the wall and like taps, try to interfere with us. They would even try to coach us into answering their taps. Of course, but they couldn't ever read it and couldn't intercept it simply because Americans are poor spellers, and we use so many abbreviations and things like that. So, like I said, but some guys got up to 30 words a minute tapping through the wall, and of course we didn't have a teacher there to count off for spelling, so that worked out good. And two, when you identified, if you're just like you're typing, sometimes you can type now and they identify where the flow is going. Next thing you know, you look down and the word you were getting ready to think of is already there, and that's exactly the way we did. And when when we identified flow, we just give 2 taps and you move on, and so we became very, very good at it. Some of us were watchers. In other words, we would lay down and look out the peepholes, and the rest of them would do the tapping, and so we had different. Everybody had his responsibility, like I said, as far as trying to communicate with other, whether it was to the next room or to the other building. We figured out how to talk through the walls. We take our blanket and roll it up like a donut and put it around our thing and just talk up into the wall like that, and you could actually physically hear somebody through a concrete wall. We discovered that by accident. We first started using a cup. Of course, with the tapping, everybody had, they just come around and check our knuckles and see who was tapping, because when you sit there and tap on a brick wall, you're going to get just different things like that. But they never wanted to give up on us. What I have here is a brick from the Hanoi Hilton that I was invited back to North Vietnam in 1995. And in fact, I met the young lady that's on the stamp with me. I learned that at the time the picture was taken, she was 17 years old. And so we did an interview with her, and as 2 warriors meeting some 30 years later, and the time we met, she was 47. Her daughter was 18, and then I had the opportunity to go down to where the Hilton once was, and they were in the process of taking it down. And surprisingly, they reused things, so they weren't destroying the building as they just took it down brick by brick. And I was able to confiscate one of the bricks from the Hilton as it was being taken down, and I brought this home with me, and I had it ever since. So someone asked me, why would I keep it? I said, just so if they ever decide to build back the Hilton, they'd be one brick shy. They're not getting this brick back. They just had to do without. My first coin in my coin collection is one that was given to me by President Nixon back in 1973 when we gathered on the White House lawn on May the 23rd, 1973. We had our reunion at the Nixon Library and for the 40th anniversary on the 23rd of May 1913, and we plan to have 2013, and we plan to have our reunion on the 23rd of May at the Nixon Library for our 50th homecoming. So we look forward to that, and like I said, that's one of my prized possessions is with the presidential seal on the back side. One other thing is I had the pleasure of meeting Nuke Hendrick, that's his signature. He was the one that designed the POW corn, or the POW flag. Yeah. He never patented it, so and now there's different claims to it, but right. He wanted to make sure that it could be used by all people without being anything. That's his signature. I never got the pleasure of meeting the man, but I talked to him several times over the phone, and he sent this one to me as a keepsake from his private collection. And let's see, what else is in the blue bag? This is basically a copycat of this being the ribbons and this being the medals. Wow. This is just one of the POW patches that you see quite prevalent on different outfits. Might as well get it all while we're here.
All right.
And this is the POW bracelets that were worn. Like I said, as explaining earlier, this is the one that's went through hell, you might say, but it survived. And on the side is a little star, and they were put on the bracelets when we came home in 1973. The blue star with a white background meant the POW survived. And if it was blue background with a white star, then he did not survive. Like I said, this one here, just the same thing. And the reason it's got tech sergeant on it, I was an E4, this is tech sergeant, so that was the rank I was when they started putting our names on the bracelet. It was a family issue. Some families did not want their son's name on these bracelets, so it didn't happen. I mean, there was a lot of respect then that we don't necessarily have now. Of course, that's just the Air Force Cross that I wear on my little jacket. I guess I call it my I Love Me jacket. And this is recognized in the National Prisoner of War site at Andersonville, Georgia, just north of Miraculous, where it was actually a Civil War prisoner of war site where 14,000 Americans died in 14 months. So it has quite a significance in American history, going back to the Civil War. And of course, that's the Thunderbirds in flight. The back emblem is basically and this one here is, they have the 50-year pin. This was a special pin that was made for all the prisoners of war, which is the 50-year pin with the POW medal at the bottom of it. And this one here is the Operation Homecoming, which is when they brought us home in 1973. This was the patch that they wore on their uniforms to honor us, and they gave us their patch that we could. And this one here is our particular patch for the 4th Combined Airlift Wing. If you notice, we have an eagle, and you notice you have the chain hanging from his thing to represent freedom. And our motto has always been, return with honor.